If you asked 1,000 Indian cricket fans where MS Dhoni is from, every single one of them would say Ranchi without blinking. Ask that same 1,000 people what state Ranchi is actually the capital of, and you'd get noticeably more hesitation. Jharkhand produced India's most successful cricket captain, the only man to win all three major ICC white ball trophies, and sits on something like 40% of the country's mineral wealth. It's also, by most surveys, one of the least name recognized states in the country relative to what actually comes out of it. That gap between what a place produces and how much credit it gets for producing it runs through basically this entire episode. Welcome back to Around India in Half an Hour. I'm Ray. Episode 10 takes us to Jharkhand, carved out of southern Bihar in the year 2000, built on some of the oldest rock and richest mineral deposits in the country, and shaped as much by tribal resistance movements most of India barely learns about in school, as by the coal and steel industries it's actually known for. We'll cover a rebellion led by a 24-year-old that's still commemorated as a national holiday, the birth of India's first private steel company, an insurgency that simmered in these forests for decades, and yes, plenty of Dhoni. Let's get into it. Jharkhand sits almost entirely on the Chota Nagpur Plateau, roughly 79,700 square kilometers of ancient, weathered upland built from some of the oldest rock in India, Precambrian granite and gneiss dating back over 500 million years, worn down over that time into a rolling hilly plateau rather than anything dramatically mountainous. The highest point, Parasnath Hill, tops out at modest 1,164 meters, but it carries outsized religious weight as the most important pilgrimage site in Jainism. More on that shortly. The Damodar River cuts a rift valley straight through the plateau's gold-bearing heart, and the Subarnarekha, whose name translates to streak of gold, runs through Ranchi on its way toward the Bay of Bengal. What makes this plateau genuinely unusual is what's underneath it. Jharkhand holds close to 40% of India's total mineral reserves. Coal, above all, concentrated in the Damodar Valley's Gondwana coalfields, plus iron ore around Singhbhum. Mica also abundant around Koderma, that the town is nicknamed the mica capital of India, along with bauxite, copper, and uranium. Centuries of dense forest cover have thinned considerably under mining and agricultural pressure, though substantial sal forest still remains, particularly in the state's western and southern districts. And it's forest, not farmland, that has historically defined how most of Jharkhand's tribal communities have organized their lives. Jharkhand borders Bihar to the north, West Bengal to the east, Odisha to the south, Chhattisgarh to the southwest, and Uttar Pradesh along a short stretch to the west, landlocked, wedged into the geographic center of eastern India, at a crossroads that colonial era rail planners exploited heavily, since Jharkhand's coal and iron sat almost exactly between Calcutta's port and the industrial heartland further west. That positioning is a large part of why heavy industry took root here specifically, rather than in neighboring states with similar mineral geology. Ranchi itself, sitting at a relatively cool 700 meters of elevation, served as the summer capital of the old Bihar province during the British period. For exactly the same reason, hill towns like Shimla and Darjeeling were pressed into similar service elsewhere. Colonial administrators reliably chased altitude once the plains' heat became unbearable. Tribal communities, Munda, Santhal, Orang, Ho, and dozens of others. 32 recognized groups in total have lived across the plateau for centuries under land systems like Khunt, where clan groups collectively held whatever land their ancestors had originally cleared, rather than any individual owning it outright. That system started breaking down hard once the British extended the Bengal permanent settlement framework into the region in the late 18th century, opening the door to outside landlords, money lenders, and revenue collectors who had no traditional claim to the land but rapid legal means of acquiring it anyway. Tribal communities didn't accept that quietly. The Call uprising in 1831 and 1832 was an early, largely localized reaction to the same pattern of outside encroachment. The Santhal Hul of 1855 and 1856, led by brothers Sidhu and Kanhu Murmu, was considerably larger. A coordinated rebellion against moneylenders and colonial police across the Rajmahal Hills that was put down with serious force but did produce the Santhal Parganas Tenancy Act, one of the first pieces of colonial legislation anywhere in India, specifically protecting tribal land rights. And then, between 1899 and 1900, came the Ulgulan, the Great Tumult, led by a 24-year-old Munda named Birsa Munda, who refused agrarian grievance with a distinct religious reform movement, urging a return to the traditional Khunt system and a rejection of both landlord exploitation and missionary conversion, despite having been educated in a German mission school himself. British forces suppressed the uprising by early 1900, and Birsa died in custody that June at just 25 under circumstances that remain disputed. One lasting legal consequence followed directly from his rebellion, the Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act of 1908, which formally restricted the transfer of tribal land to non tribal owners. That law remains in force today and remains genuinely contested. State government attempts to amend it in 2016 and 2017 to ease land acquisition for industrial projects provoked large enough protests that the amendments were ultimately withdrawn. Birsa is remembered today as Dharti Aba, father of the earth, and his birthday, November 15th, was designated a national holiday, Janjatiya Gaurav Divas, in 2021. And it's not a coincidence that the same date was chosen over a century after his death as the day Jharkhand itself officially became a state. That statehood took a long time coming. The demand for a separate tribal minority, the demand for a separate tribal majority state carved out of Bihar dates back to organized political movements in the 1920s and 30s, driven by the sense that this mineral rich but tribal heavy region was being administered from and its wealth extracted toward a Bihari political establishment with limited stake in local tribal welfare. The movement gained serious momentum through the 1970s and 80s under the Jharkhand Mukti Morcha and finally succeeded on November 15th, 2000, when Jharkhand became India's 28th state, with Ranchi as its capital and Babulal Marandi as its first chief minister. Industrially, the region's other defining moment came decades later. In 1907, the industrialist Jamshedji Tata identified the area near the confluence of the Subarnarekha and Kharkai rivers as the site for India's first integrated private steel plant, drawn by the same iron ore and coal deposits that had shaped everything else about this plateau. The resulting planned company town, later named Jamshedpur in his honor, became India's first fully planned industrial city and remains Tata Steel's operational headquarters. A rare example of a colonial era Indian industrial venture that was privately Indian owned and managed from the outset rather than controlled by British capital. Jharkhand's population sits at roughly 38 million, with tribal communities making up about a quarter of that total, a substantial share, though a minority overall, given significant non tribal migration into the region over the past century for mining and industrial work, which is itself a long running source of tension over land, jobs, and political representation between original tribal residents and later settlers. The current Chief Minister, Hemant Soren, of the Jharkhand Mukti Morcha, has led the state for most of the period since 2019, with one significant interruption. In early 2024, Soren resigned and was arrested by the India's Enforcement Directorate on money laundering charges connected to an alleged illegal land acquisition, spending roughly 5 months in custody before being released on bail in June 2024 and returning to the Chief Minister's post the following month. The case remains part of the state's political backdrop. Soren, the son of JMM founder Shibu Soren, denies wrongdoing. Economically, Jharkhand's government has spent 2026 explicitly trying to pivot the state's image beyond mining, pitching a 25-year development vision at forums like Davos, courting investment in digital infrastructure and AI, alongside more traditional steel and coal projects, and pulling in tens of thousands of crores in investment pledges across sectors from renewable energy to food processing. Large parts of the state, particularly its southern and western forested districts, have also experienced a long running Naxalite or Maoist insurgency since the late 1960s, an armed movement originating from land and tribal rights grievances not entirely dissimilar from those behind the 29th century rebellions, though considerably more violent and criminalized over time. Security operations have significantly reduced the insurgency's reach over the past decade, though pockets of activity persist in some districts. The tension between resource driven state revenue and the on the ground reality for many tribal communities living closest to that mining activity over land compensation, displacement, and environmental damage remains an active unresolved policy debate rather than a settled question. Mahendra Singh Dhoni, born in Ranchi in 1981 to a family that had migrated from Uttarakhand, started out working as a railway ticket collector before becoming India's most successful cricket captain to any reasonable measure. The only captain in the sport's history to win the T20 World Cup, the ODI World Cup, and the Champions Trophy, and the only Indian captain to lead the Test team to the number one world ranking. His calm, unhurried demeanor under pressure earned him the nickname Captain Cool, and he remains one of the most commercially and personally influential figures in Indian sport well past his playing peak. Birsa Munda, covered in the history section, belongs here too. A spiritual and political leader who died at 25 but remains one of the most widely revered tribal figures in Indian history. His portrait hanging in Parliament and his name attached to Jharkhand's founding date itself. Deepika Kumari, from a farming family outside Ranchi, took up archery on a bamboo bow as a child and rose to become one of the sport's most dominant figures globally, holding the world number one ranking multiple times and competing at three Olympic Games, part of a broader, less publicized tradition of tribal archery skill across Jharkhand that the sport's national program has increasingly drawn on for talent. Jharkhand's food runs simpler and less heavily spiced than much of North Indian cuisine, built around rice, lentils, and whatever the forest and field provide. Litti chokha, baked wheat flour balls stuffed and roasted sattu, served with mashed, fire roasted eggplant and potato, is shared with neighboring Bihar but eaten just as widely here. A dish that travels well because it was originally designed to. Dense, portable, and originally associated with field laborers and travelers who needed food that would keep. Dhuska, a deep fried pancake made from rice and lentil batter, is typically paired with ghugni, a spiced black chickpea curry, and sold everywhere from roadside stalls to wedding spreads. Rugra, a wild mushroom that grows specifically on sal trees during the monsoon, is treated as a genuine forest delicacy, cooked into a spice curry and available only seasonally, which makes it something people specifically travel for when it's in. Thekwa, a dense, deep fried wheat and jaggery sweet, and arsa roti, a jaggery sweetened rice flour pancake, both show up heavily during festive season. And handia, a mildly alcoholic rice beer fermented with local herbs and a traditional starter culture, remains a genuinely important part of tribal social and ceremonial life across the state. Despite periodic government efforts to regulate or restrict its informal production. Ranchi, the capital, is the first place on our places to visit list. It's locally known as the City of Waterfalls. Hundru, Dasam, and Jonha Falls all sit within a short drive along the Tagore Hills and the Rock Garden. Jamshedpur, India's first planned industrial city, pairs the Tata Steel plant's imposing industrial presence with genuinely green, well planned residential districts and the Dalma Wildlife Sanctuary nearby, home to wild elephants. Deoghar draws serious religious tourism as the site of the Baidyanath temple, one of the 12 Jyotirlinga shrines sacred to Shiva, particularly during the Shravani Mela each July and August, when pilgrims carry holy water on foot for over 100 kilometers to the temple. Parasnath Hill, meanwhile, is Jainism's most sacred pilgrimage site, known to Jains as Shikharji, and believed to be where 20 of the religious 24 Tirthankaras attained liberation. In 2023, a state government plan to develop the hill for broader ecotourism drew significant protest from the Jain community, who argued it risked disrupting the site's strictly religious character, and the plan was ultimately scaled back. Netarhat, a hill station in the state's west known as the Queen of Chota Nagpur, offers some of the region's best sunrise and sunset views from a plateau edge over 1,000 meters up. And Betla National Park, part of the Palamu Tiger Reserve, remains one of the better spots in eastern India to see wild elephants and, with real luck, tigers. Jharkhand, of course, uses the Indian rupee, trading at roughly 95 to 96 to the US dollar as of mid 2026. As always, worth checking a live rate before travel. The state's economy has historically run almost entirely on extraction and heavy industry, coal, iron ore, and other minerals, feeding steel plant production at Jamshedpur and Bokaro, with Coal India and Tata Steel among the largest employers in the state. That dependence has real costs. Mining regions have dealt with land displacement, environmental degradation, and a persistent gap between mineral revenue generated and development actually reaching nearby tribal communities. A gap that state and central politicians across parties have acknowledged without fully resolving. The current government's stated pivot toward digital infrastructure, renewable energy, and diversified manufacturing is explicitly framed as an attempt to reduce that historical dependence on extraction, though coal and steel remain by a wide margin the backbone of state revenue today. Within India, Jharkhand is shorthand for two things above all: mineral wealth and MS Dhoni, in roughly that order of economic importance and reverse order of name recognition. Internationally, the state has almost no independent profile at all. Most global awareness of Indian steel and or Indian coal doesn't trace back to a specific state, even though a huge share of it originates here. What gets even less attention nationally or internationally is the depth and continuity of the tribal resistance history that shaped the place, running in an unbroken line from the coal uprising through Birsa Munda to the statehood movement itself. Sohrai and Kohvar wall painting, traditionally done by women using natural pigments, clay, charcoal, colored earth, directly onto mud house walls during harvest and wedding seasons, respectively, is among Jharkhand's most distinctive visual art forms and has increasingly moved from village walls into canvas and paper for wider sale as demand from outside the region has grown. Petkar painting, a scroll based narrative art form traditionally used by traveling storytellers to illustrate folk tales and religious stories panel by panel, is a much older and now fairly rare craft, actively being revived through state cultural programs. Festivals carry real cultural weight here. Sarhul, celebrated in March and April, marks the flowering of the sal tree and functions as a kind of tribal new year, while Karam in August or September centers on tree worship and fertility of the harvest. Tusu, a winter harvest festival particularly associated with young unmarried women, involves elaborate handmade clay and bamboo effigies carried in procession and eventually immersed in local rivers. Cricket is inevitably the headline of sports, largely because of one person. MS Dhoni's success helped put the JSCA International Stadium in Ranchi on the international hosting circuit, something that would have been unthinkable for a Jharkhand venue a generation earlier. But archery deserves a real mention too. Deepika Kumari's career reflects a broader tribal archery tradition across the state that national talent programs have leaned on increasingly heavily. Given how many young tribal athletes grow up with functional bow and arrow skills as a matter of course rather than formal training. Hockey has a real, if less publicized, following in tribal districts, tracing back to the same colonial era mission school sports programs that shaped hockey talent pipelines across tribal regions of eastern and central India more broadly. Most Indians outside Jharkhand know the state, if they know it at all, through two complete separate mental images that rarely get connected: MS Dhoni's "Small Town Boy Makes Good" story and vague awareness of coal mining and Naxalite conflict in some forested and unspecified part of eastern India. Few people outside the state connect those two things in the same place or realize both are downstream of the same basic fact: an extraordinarily resource rich region whose wealth has historically flowed outward faster than development has flowed in. What Jharkhand does well and gets little credit for nationally: a tribal culture and artistic tradition from Sohrai painting to the Ulgulan itself, with a continuity and coherence that few Indian regions can match. The tension the state is actively navigating right now out in the open is the same one that's defined it since long before it had its own name: how to convert what's under the ground into a life worth living for the people standing on top of it. Jharkhand's government talks a lot right now about a 25-year plan to move past mining altogether. AI, renewable energy, digital infrastructure, the full modern pivot. Whether that actually happens or not, one thing seems unlikely to change anytime soon. This will keep being a place most of India knows things from without knowing all that much about. Good call, good cricket. A name a lot of the country still can't quite place on a map. Next stop, alphabetically, Karnataka. Coffee, Bangalore's tech boom, and a very different version of modern India. Thanks for tuning into Around India in half an hour. If this one was worth your time, hit follow and leave a review. It genuinely helps. Catch you next Tuesday.